For these berries, let's do something a little bit different. Let's do what's called stump work. And if you are not familiar with the term stump work, all it means is it's just embroidery that is raised off of the surface of the fabric. So you're doing something to make it look a little bit three-dimensional. And you can use wire in stump work and stitch over the wire and make a certain shape and cut it out, and then, you know, make that leaf shape or whatever, sit up off the fabric. But you can also pad it. And many years ago in history, they used horsehair. What we're going to use is something much more simple. And we're going to use just a plain old cotton ball. And when I drew these berries, I did not have an idea of what I was going to do or how I was going to stitch them, how I was going to make them come to life. And it's taken me weeks to finally figure out what I wanted to do. And once I realized that I wanted to do something dimensional, I knew immediately what I wanted them to look like. So, what we're going to do is start out with the cotton ball. And here's our little shape, our little oval. And you're going to want to pinch off just a small bit of that cotton. Now, that may not be enough. So you're going to, first of all, just sort of make it into a little round shape. And that's actually not enough. It's too going to be too flat. So I'm not going to try to add anything to that. It's just too hard to combine it, and cotton balls are cheap. So I'm going to come back to my cotton ball and I'm going to try again, and I'm going to pull off. So it's better to start out with a little too much cotton than it is not enough. So that's what I have there, and that's probably going to be too much, but I'm going to start out by kind of forming it into sort of an oval shape, just kind of like that. And then now I'm going to see if I have gotten the amount, because that still has, it's kind of flat and it's not really compressed very much. So I'm going to put it in the center of my hand. I'm going to put my other hand on top. I know it's hard to see this, and I'm going to press my palms together. I'm going to do that off camera because that's going to make you dizzy. And I am trying to compress that cotton into a shape that's similar to this little oval. So I mean, you can try doing that with your fingers, but it kind of wants to just squish. So this one is giving me a little more trouble than usual. But if you just keep working with it, you will eventually end up with a shape that is roughly oval and sort of compressed. So it doesn't just have like loose, you know, um, fibers of cotton just like hanging out. So I'm going to put this on my oval and see if it's roughly. Okay, so I think that's still maybe too much cotton, even though it's going to compress a little bit. So I'm going to try to just pull off a little bit around the edge. Fold it back up, see if I can get it to be. Sometimes I get this right on the very first one. I pull off just the right amount of cotton, and then I roll it between my palms, and it just comes out perfectly just right from the beginning. Sometimes you have to work with it a little bit. So I think that piece is probably just about right. Now it's going to compress a little bit when I stitch over it. So if it looks a little bit big, that's all right. You don't want it too big because then it's hard to get the threads to lay flat on it. And you don't want it to be so flat that there's just nothing there really. But so generally get it to fit on your oval shape. So right now it's hanging over the edges just a little bit. But that's okay. I'm going to start to take my needle and kind of maybe tuck those ends under, because now I'm going to start stitching this down. So what I'm using for this part, I'm using 2 strands of thread. And for this everything we're going to do on this berry, it's really important how you separate the strands of thread. And this is just the same. What we're going to be doing essentially is satin stitching. And so when you're satin stitching, whether it's flat or over a raised shape. It's really important how you separate the strands. If you're asking yourself why it's so important about how you pull apart the threads, that's because it makes a difference in the way they lay down next to each other on your work. So if you are the type of person that just say you need two strands, well, here's two and here's two, and if you just pull them apart, that'll get you two strands, right? But the threads remain twisted if you just pull them. I can't stand pulling, separating strands that way because when you pull them apart, they twist back up on themselves and they just stay twisty and it's just a hassle to me. So the way that I separate all of my strands of thread is called stripping. Now, I have an entire video that shows you exactly how to do this with lots of good detail, but here's the quick version. Hold the strands, the end of the strands of the thread in your hand. Separate out one strand, regardless of how many strands you're eventually going to need. Separate one strand of thread. A thread, that's funny. Okay, anyway, grab it with this hand and then gently hold it with these two fingers and then just pull it out. And you'll see, I know I'm up close here. As I pull, you'll see those other strands spiral up, just like that. And then they kind of pop back out. That's okay. Just rearrange those. And now I have pulled out one strand. So I lay this on my table, and if I need another strand, if I'm using one strand, I'm good. If I need another strand, I do that again, and I lay that strand next to this strand, and then I combine them, and then I put them on my needle. So that's a quick lesson in how to strip threads. So that's what I have here. I have two strands on my needle. I know some people get confused, especially if you're a beginner. What does two strands mean? Do you put it through the needle and then match up the ends and tie them? That will give you four strands. What I do is I pull it through just a little bit so that I have, maybe a third of that thread is up here, but by the time I get down to the end here, I have two strands. So I'm actually stitching with two strands, and then I tie a knot in the end. But anyway, what stripping does is it causes the threads to lay down next to each other instead of being twisted in sort of like a rope. And that will give you that really shiny, smooth finish when you are satin stitching. So let's get to the actual stitching. Enough talking. So I'm going to hold this in place and sort of gently tuck those ends underneath. But I'm going to stitch across. I'm going to hold that out of the way just a little bit so I'm making sure I'm coming up right on the line. I am going to, now these stitches are not really going to show, but they are holding, they're going to sort of define the shape of the berry, and they're going to hold it in place. Now when I pull, tension is the other thing on these berries that's really important. You don't want to pull too hard. So when I pull that across, I'm not cinching it down so hard that I'm flattening out that piece of cotton. So now I'm going to pull that over to the side again. I'm going to come up here. Make sure I'm coming right on the line because it's a little hard to see while that cotton is still kind of puffy like that. I'm going to come across to the other side, make sure I can go down on the line. I'm going to very gently pull that stitch again. I'm going to come across, come down to the bottom part. And go across this bottom section. And I am not just pulling and letting this thread go wherever it wants. I am gently guiding it. So I don't want it to slip off on the bottom like that. I want it to lay on top, go over that bit of cotton. It's a little bit tricky there on the end, so I'm not pulling very hard. I think I'm going to put a few more horizontal stitches in so that it's really in place. Like I said, these ones on the end do like to sort of slip off, but that's okay. I think I'm going to put another stitch here, another stitch here, because that's just too, it's just not really contained quite yet. So I'm going to put one across there. And I'm always pushing that cotton aside so I can make sure that I'm taking my needle down on the pattern line. Otherwise these would just get all, they would, if I, see how that's sticking out? If I brought the needle up out here, then my berry is all out of shape. I am pushing that under, moving it aside with my finger, and making sure that the needle comes up right on the pattern line. I'm going to go across that one, that section. Alright, so now that it's sort of more contained, it's a little bit wonky, but that's okay. I am going to, as I'm stitching, I can always take the tip of my needle and I can sort of tuck that cotton underneath a little bit more if I need to, but all these stitches that I'm making on top of this cotton, I don't ever want to come up through the cotton itself on that edge right there. I want to make sure that I'm always encasing all of that cotton. So now I'm going to start working on, those were the horizontal stitches. Now I'm going to start working on the stitches that will actually be seen, and they're going to go vertically. So I like to start in the middle. I'm going to bring that thread up, lay it across there, and go down. So now this is the part, those horizontal stitches, it didn't really matter how the threads laid down because we were not going to see that anyway. A little more round on the end. Okay, so now I'm being really careful that I am not pulling that thread so hard that I am losing the roundness, the sort of dome shape. So now I'm just going to satin stitch until this whole thing is covered. But I'm going to take my time and make sure that these threads are laying flat. This is where I do not want them to be twisted around each other. Even two strands, I want them to lay next to each other. I want every stitch for the two strands to be laying down side by side. So sometimes I'll very gently take these fingers and kind of run them up, and I will lay those stitches down across that domed section of the cotton. And then what I will also do is to help keep them in place is instead of just yanking the thread through, I'll lay it in place just like I've done here, and I'll put my finger on it, and then I will pull the thread the rest of the way. That keeps, especially as you work over to these sides, it can be a little bit, the threads sometimes want to slip off to the side, but if I hold them in place as I make each stitch, in other words, I'm not going to just let the stitches end up where they want to end up. I am going to make sure that they are ending up where I want them to end up. So I'm going to hold that in place and pull that through, really being gentle. Sometimes I'll hop over to this other side and work over here. Well, that one went a little to the side. That's okay. I want to bring that one across there. I know it's a little bit hard to see where, even I'm having a hard time seeing where I'm putting the needle down. All those shadows. I'm going to hold that in place and gently pull it. And I'm just going to keep doing this until the whole thing is covered. And you really want to make sure that there are no thin spots across the top of this thing, because later on when we add the green, this green part here at the bottom, it can these threads that are laying on top can get a little bit separated. So I want to make sure that I really have good coverage. So don't be afraid to keep adding some stitches so that there's just no thin spots whatsoever. The other thing that you want to be aware of that you're not doing is I don't want to make, that one did want to move over, didn't it? Let's see if I can get it to behave. You don't want to have one stitch be really tight and the stitch next to it be a lot looser, because that will cause it to look like it has ripples. And I have a little bit of that trouble here. Let me see if I can kind of make that look better. I have a big hole right there. So I'm going to try to get that thread to lay down flat right where I want it. And I want to emphasize I'm really not pulling very hard on the back. I'm not cinching these threads up tight. Now, are they loose, you know, like totally loose on top of this cotton? No, but I'm not just cinching them down really hard. Sometimes you can take your finger and kind of smooth them down. So I think I have, I think I have a hole, but I'm going to come over here on this side and talk about the side here. So what I will do, I think I can put one more. You do want to look at it from the side, because I don't know if you can see that, but I still have some cotton here showing and some space. So I am going to kind of work some stitches that are laying more against the fabric. But I'm still kind of doing the same thing. I still want to make sure that I'm filling in any thin spots. I can still hold that thread to kind of go where I want it to go. And you'd think with this being rounded that all the threads are just going to slide off the side, and they really don't. I mean, like I said, you do have to be gentle with it and kind of coax the threads to stay where you want them to stay. You can't just pull the thread and just hope for the best. You can absolutely get them to be where you want them to be. It just takes a little bit of patience and kind of a gentle hand. So now I'm going to come over here. So see how I have a hole right there? I'm going to lay that thread across there. And you see, if I let this just be up like this and I just pull it, it's not necessarily going to go where I want it to go. So I'm going to lay it in place, hold it, and then pull it through. That technique really does work. I think I still have a thin spot right there. Did that get it? Hopefully. And I may need a stitch over here on this side. These stitches on the side, they kind of wrap around, and instead of being, laying on top, like a stitch like this, they kind of are turned this way, so they hug the sides. They go around the side that way. So that's what I'm about to do here. A little bit of left-handed stitching there. So I'm kind of putting that stitch in at an angle, and so that this one will cover that side there. Sometimes you can kind of move the hoop around. You can look at it from that direction as opposed to straight down. But I am hoping that I have pretty much completely covered. Maybe add one more across the top, right there. Okay, I think that's good. The little green parts at the bottom of these berries, or you could call them buds actually. I know they might be flower buds, whatever. Anyway, this little green section, we're going to use 4 strands of the DMC in a variety of greens, okay? So same thing though here. When you separate these strands, you want to strip them so that, let me see if I can show you. See how they're laying, well, let me get them there. So see how they're laying flat and they look very satiny? They're not twisted in a rope. So again, very important to strip the threads for this. And sometimes what I'll also do as I'm putting the thread on my needle, I'll take my thumbnail, and I will run the threads several times between my thumbnail, and that kind of also encourages them to line up instead of be kind of all twisted up. So anyway, there we go, 4 strands, and the stitch we're going to use for this little section is technically a fly stitch, but we're going to do it in a certain order and over the sort of bottom third of this little bud, berry, whatever. So I'm going to start, I'm going to come up on one side about a third of the way up. So, and we're trying to do is to get this little V, this little layered V effect. Hopefully you can see that. All right. So to do that, I'm going to come up about a third of the way from the bottom. All right. That's where I really want to encourage these threads to be flat, and I'm going to lay it across, and I'm going to go down on the other side. Okay, but I am not going to cinch that stitch up tight. I'm going to hold it out, and I'm going to come up at the bottom center, like that, and I'm going to pull this thread through. And so now I am going to, come on, lay flat. This, I found it really does want to twist up. You see that right there? It really does want to twist up. So I do spend a little bit of time in fact, in some ways it's easier to work on these when they're not vertical like this. Okay, well I've totally messed this up now. All right. Let me see if I can get you to lay flat. It is a little bit tricky, I'll admit. All right. So I'm going to try to hold that so it lays flat. Pull this one up. Okay, that's a little bit better. Sometimes I just want to misbehave. All right, so that one's fairly, little bit of a twist there, but anyway. So I've pulled it so it's snug against that little bud, and now I'm going to fold it back this way, and I'm going to very gently pull it. I don't want to pull it too hard, but I'm going to take the needle down, put the needle down right back in the center. And I want these little straight stitches to try to lay flat too. So I am not pulling that very hard at all on the back. So now I've got that first one. Now I'm going to come and I'm going to do that same exact stitch up here, but just right above it. So yes, I am sort of technically covering up this stitch, but that first stitch is providing a little bit of dimension. So let me see if I can get this thread to behave. Come on, work with me. I'm going to go down just above that other stitch. Okay, so this one's going to behave a little bit better, I think. All right, same thing. Come up in the center, right there on the stem, but come up inside that loop. Pull this up. Go ahead and pull it so that it is snugged up against the bud. But now I'm going to fold that back over, very gently pull it, and go down. All right. I'm going to do the exact same thing, but I'm going to make 2 stitches now in front of or below the 2 that I just did. So those are kind of the background stitches, but I'm going to really come up very close to where I came up before. Try to get those threads to be all in line. Like that. Same thing though, come right up next to that, those where I went down for the other ones. Pull it so that it's, now this is the one that really shows, so you want to be, move slowly, go be patient. Pull it so that it's, I don't want to pull it so hard that I yank it down below the bud. And I'm going to fold it back and go down right next to those other stitches. So that one I pulled a little bit hard, but I'm going to put another stitch right here on top, like that, right there. So see, I kind of have this big space right here, right there between that and that one, but that's why I'm going to put another stitch. So same thing, come slightly above the one I just did, get those threads to be all lined up. All right, see how those are lined up? But come down here. Come up inside the loop. All right. And now gently fold that back. And here's the part where you really don't want to pull hard. If you pull too hard, I'll just pull that just out of place. I don't want that. So I'm going to very gently just lay that, that stitch down, not even pulling that hard. Put the needle down. And very gently, I'm not pulling that thread tight at all on the back. So this one was a little messier than I would like. Some of them, like that one, I did a nice job of getting all of those threads really flat, but it's still a neat effect. So you can kind of tease them to be a little bit flat. There we go. So now you're not quite done, because normally when I flip this over, I would flip it over and I would tie a knot up tight against the fabric, which requires me tugging pretty hard on my thread on the back. In fact, let me just flip it over and show you. All right, here's the back of my work. Normally I would take this thread and I would put the needle through it and I would do this and I would pull really hard and I would get that stitch to be that knot. I would make a knot that was right up against the fabric. But to do that, I would have to pull on this thread pretty hard. And if I pull this, I'm going to pull that stitch on the front. I'm going to pull it out of alignment, and I don't want to do that. Ask me how I know, because I couldn't get it to work at first. I kept pulling that stitch out of place. So instead of doing any kind of a knot for this one, I'm really going to just do a very gentle, just make a couple of stitches through the work I've already done, and I'm not right here, I'm not going to pull hard. I'm just going to barely pull it. And now I'm going to just make a couple of little stitches, maybe one more. So that will hold that thread, but it'll keep the thread from coming back through on the front, but it does not pull that stitch out of alignment. So let me flip it over and see if I was successful. And I would say that yes, I was, because I did not pull that one stitch right there so tight that it got this one out of alignment. So I kept that one in place by not pulling on it too hard. So the next thing to do is to stitch the stems, and I just stitched the stem with the same 4 strands of the same exact color that I used for, whichever color I used for this little green part. I just stitched the stem the same way. Yes, you could definitely go ahead and instead of flipping it over on the back and tying off that thread, you could just start stitching, but I really want to I just wanted to make sure that I preserved the tension on that stitch, so I just tied it off and started again, started anew. a new thread. But this is just what we've done before. It's just a simple split back stitch. All the way down till each stem is finished. This one's a little bit different because we're using 4 strands, so it has a little bit more of a texture to it. Ouch. All right, there we go. All right, so just finish up that strand, and we've got one more thing to do on this little bud. Last thing to do is to put these super fun fluorescent-y kind of pink beads here at the ends. So we're going to start out by I've got one strand of just any one of the pink threads. It doesn't really matter, or even the orange or yellow threads, doesn't matter. But I just chose one of that kind of coral pink, and I am going to come up right at the top center. Now let me give you a little hint about beads. These are going to lay on their sides. You know, there's the whole side up if it's like this, or it can lay on its side, and I'm going to lay it on its side. So if I were to bring the needle up in the same exact place, run it through the bead and go back down, take the needle down in the exact same place, that bead is going to wobble. You know, it's going to go like this because it's not the thread going through it. I don't know how to describe it. Is not very stable. So let me try to draw this. Hang on a second. All right, here's a super quick explanation. I want the bead to sit on its side like that, not on its face like that. So in order to do that, I do not want to bring the thread up, bring it up, put the bead through it, and then go right back down in the same exact place, because that will cause the bead to wobble from side to side. So in order to give it some stability, I'm going to bring the thread up here. Let's say, bring it up, put the bead, the needle and thread through the bead, and when I come back down, I want to go down right there. Does that make sense? So now, when the bead is in place, it will be attached here. The thread will run through the side, through the hole, and it will go down there. All right, hopefully that makes sense for you. It's one of those things that's harder to describe than it is to actually show you. So let me show you. All right, so I'm bringing my needle up at the top center, but a little bit off center. I've got my beads in a bowl here, so I can, a little bit hard to see, but now I can just press down the tip of the needle like that. Get one bead, run it down into place, and I will take the needle down just next to about the width of the bead, and now the bead will sit on its side. I'll do the same thing on the left. Get a bead. And go down just next to where I came up. And do the same thing on the other side. Just like that, and that one's done. All right, so those are these really cool stump work. You know, I started out calling them berries, but I think I'm going to switch to calling them flower buds. Anyway, those are the stump work flower buds.